A lawyer stood at the edge of a small cemetery on a Wednesday morning in November, and he was the only one there who knew what was about to happen. His name was Douglas Fenn. He was 61 years old, meticulous by nature, and he had handled the estates of wealthy men for 34 years without once being surprised by grief. He was surprised now, not by the grave, which was a modest rectangle of dark soil next to a granite marker, simple as the man who'd ordered it. What surprised him was the woman standing at the far end of the plot, in a pair of green scrubs and a wool coat that had seen too many winters. She was not crying. She was singing, low and steady, her voice barely carrying above the wind, and she had been singing since before Douglas arrived and had not stopped when he walked up. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the grave and her hands folded in front of her, and she finished the song before she acknowledged that anyone else was there. Douglas had a sealed envelope in the inner pocket of his coat. He had a name written on a notepad in his car. He had a description Walter Halloway had given him 6 weeks ago in a voice that was already going thin, of a woman with a particular way of singing who came to him at night and made the dark feel smaller. Douglas looked at the woman in the scrubs and the worn coat and understood he had found her. She had no idea. She had come here on her day off because she thought no one else would, and she had no idea what was waiting in that envelope, what the man in that grave had decided, or how thoroughly her life was about to change. Kindness given freely in the dark, when no one is watching and no reward is expected, has a way of being remembered. Walter Halloway had remembered. Renee Moss had been a hospice aide for 7 years. She was 38 years old, and she earned $14 an hour, and she worked the overnight shift 4 nights a week at Cedarview Hospice in the east wing of a converted Victorian building that smelled of floor cleaner and warm linen. She had chosen the night shift deliberately, years ago, because the day shift cost more in childcare, and because the nights were quieter, and because she found, in the particular silence of those hours, that she could be fully present with her patients in a way the busyness of daytime never allowed. She raised her daughter, Cora, alone. Cora was 15 and did her homework at the kitchen table of their rented 2-bedroom apartment on Marsh Street, and never complained about the noise from the unit above them or the radiator that clanged every night at 11. She had her mother's steady eyes and her mother's habit of finishing what she started, and she had learned early not to ask for things that weren't possible. She knew what $14 an hour looked like. When you divided it across rent and groceries and the copay for her asthma inhaler and the second-hand winter jacket she'd picked out herself from the thrift store on Green Avenue, because she could see her mother doing the math in her head, and she didn't want to be another variable in that equation. Renee noticed, even when Cora tried to hide it. There was a budget spreadsheet on Renee's phone that she updated every Sunday after she got home from her last shift of the week. Rent was $840. Utilities ran another $120 more in January. Groceries, carefully managed, came to about $210 a month. The inhaler, even with insurance, was $45 every refill. She had a checking account that rarely held more than $200 as a buffer, and a savings account with $312 in it that she had not touched in 14 months. She was not in debt, which was something she was quietly proud of, but she was also not anywhere near safe. The distance between her and financial catastrophe was about 6 weeks of wages, and she knew it. And she went to work anyway, and did her job carefully, and came home and made oatmeal and told Cora about her night without naming any of the patients. She had started singing by accident. In her 3rd year at Cedarview, she had a patient named Mr. Gaines, a retired postman from the north side of the city who was in the last days of a long illness and could no longer speak, but whose hands would grip the bed rail in the small hours when the building settled and the dark got very large. Renee had tried everything she knew, adjusting his pillow, checking his lines, sitting with her hand over his, and one night she had simply started humming because she didn't know what else to give him, and the silence felt unkind. His hands had loosened on the rail. She had kept humming until he slept. After that, she had started to sing properly, quietly, nothing elaborate, old hymns mostly, and a few slow folk songs her grandmother used to play on a little kitchen radio, and she found that it worked in a way that nothing clinical could replicate. It settled people. It reminded them that they were not alone. She sang to nearly every overnight patient she had from that point forward. She did not announce it, and she did not make a performance of it. She waited until the lights were down and the floor was quiet, and she sat in the chair beside the bed and sang 2 or 3 songs in a voice that stayed just above a whisper. And then she got up and continued her rounds. Her coworker Denise, who worked the same overnight rotation and had known Renee for 4 of those 7 years, had heard her once through a doorway and stood in the corridor for a few minutes before she knocked on the frame to signal her presence. "You know, you could have been something with that voice," Denise had said. "I am something," Renee had told her, not unkindly. Denise had let it go. She brought it up again every few months in the same gentle, wondering tone, and Renee always gave some version of the same answer. And they had built a warm and easy friendship around that particular loop of conversation. Denise was 43, originally from Georgia, and she brought enough food to every shift to share with the entire overnight staff, which some nights was just the 2 of them and a nursing supervisor who ate at her desk. She had 3 grown children who called her on Sunday mornings, and she kept a photograph of all of them in her locker. She was the first person Renee told when something at work mattered enough to say out loud. Walter Halloway arrived at Cedarview on a Thursday in mid-August. He was listed as having no next of kin. His intake paperwork named Douglas Fenn, attorney, as his emergency contact and the party to be notified upon his death. There was a contact number and a suite address at a downtown law firm, and nothing else in the family section. Renee read through his chart on her first overnight shift with him because she read every new patient's chart fully, not just the medical summary. And she noticed the empty family section, the way you notice a room with no furniture. It didn't change how she did her job. It just told her what kind of quiet she was walking into. Walter was 81 years old. He had been a private man all his life, which was visible in the way he occupied space even now, lying in the adjusted bed by the window with his hands flat on the blanket, and his eyes moving to the door when she came in and then back to the ceiling when he determined she was not a threat. He was skeletal in the way of men who have been ill for a long time, but his face still had structure to it, a long jaw and deep-set eyes that were surprisingly sharp for someone this far into the process. He didn't speak much. He answered her intake questions in short sentences, nodded when he understood what she was going to do before she did it, and thanked her afterward in a formal, practiced way, as if politeness were a discipline he had maintained so long it had become automatic. His room had a window that looked onto the parking lot, which wasn't scenic, but the light came through it in a particular way in the early morning that turned the ceiling a warm amber, and Renee noted this on her first shift and decided it mattered to him, even if he hadn't said so. She angled the blinds on her way out so the morning light would reach him. She did not sing to him that first night. She sat with him for the standard 20 minutes after his medications, answered 2 questions he asked in a low voice about what the morning schedule would be, and left when his eyes closed. The second night she came in at her usual time and found him awake, which was not unusual, lying very still and looking at the place on the ceiling where the light would be in a few hours. She did her checks. She sat down. After a few minutes, she began to hum, the old reflex, low and careful, watching his face. His hands, which had been flat and slightly tense against the blanket, spread open. She kept humming. He closed his eyes. After a few minutes, she moved into the words almost nothing, barely audible, an old hymn her grandmother had called a going-home song, and she sat with him until he was asleep, and then she got up quietly and went back to her rounds. He didn't mention it the next night. Neither did she. Over the following 11 weeks, it became a ritual, which is to say, it became something neither of them named or discussed, but that both of them understood to be fixed in the structure of the night. Renee would come in, do her clinical checks, and after the lights were down, she would sit in the chair and sing for 15 or 20 minutes, sometimes hymns, sometimes the slow old folk songs, once in a while something her grandmother had sung in a different language that Renee only half remembered the words to, but could carry the tune of from beginning to end. Walter lay with his eyes closed and his hands open, and said nothing. Some nights, when she reached the last verse of something he seemed to recognize, his lips moved slightly. Not singing, just following. The way you trace a familiar shape you haven't touched in years. She did not know in those 11 weeks anything about who Walter Halloway was beyond what his chart told her. The chart told her his age and his diagnosis and his medications, and his DNR status, and the name of his attorney. It did not tell her that Walter Halloway had spent 40 years building a manufacturing company, that he sold in his late 60s for a sum large enough that the Regional Business Journal had run a brief item about it. It did not tell her that he had, in the 10 years since the sale, quietly endowed a charitable foundation that bore his name and provided operational funding to 11 hospice and end-of-life care organizations in the state. It did not tell her that Walter had been thinking about what happened to people who died alone long before he became one of them, and that his thinking about it had a very specific and practical shape. None of that was in his chart. His chart said he was a private patient with no family and a lawyer to call. Denise noticed the pattern before the 4th week was up. "You stay longer in that room than any of the others," she said one night, in the break room over instant coffee and a container of leftover rice and beans she'd brought from home. She said it without accusation, just as an observation, the kind she was good at. "He doesn't sleep easily," Renee said. "Neither do half the people in this wing." "No," Renee agreed. She stirred her coffee. "But he's alone. Truly alone. Nobody comes, nobody calls, and he knows it." She set the spoon down. "I just stay a little longer." Denise looked at her for a moment. "You singing to him?" "Some." Denise nodded once and let it go. She would bring it up again in 6 weeks when Walter's condition changed and the shifts got harder, and Renee's answers would be the same, and Denise's nods would carry more weight. In early October, Walter had a rough 2 weeks. His pain increased, and his sleep became erratic, and there were 3 nights in a row where he was awake when Renee arrived and still awake when she left, his breathing shallow and his eyes fixed on the ceiling, with an expression she had learned to read as endurance rather than distress. She sat with him longer on those nights. She sang more. Once, when she had exhausted her usual songs and he was still not settled, she sang something she'd made up years ago for Cora. When Cora was small and afraid in the night, a slow, simple thing with no particular words that was more like a pattern of sound than a song. Walter was asleep before she reached the second pass through it. On her way out, she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him, his hands open, his face finally slack. and she thought about the apartment on Marsh Street, and Cora doing her homework and the Sunday spreadsheet, and the $312 in savings that hadn't moved in 14 months, and she felt, as she sometimes did at the end of a long stretch, the specific weight of giving something you can't afford to spare. She gave it anyway because she didn't know how not to. That was the thing about Renee that the spreadsheet didn't capture. In late October, Denise found her in the break room one morning looking more tired than usual, and Renee told her that the overtime she'd been covering all month wasn't going to be approved for November, and that meant a smaller check coming just before Cora's school needed the activity fee for spring semester. $45, the same number as the inhaler. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, not asking for sympathy, just naming what was true. You could pick up a day shift here and there, Denise offered. Cora gets home at 3:30. I'd need to be out by 3. Ask Mrs. Haddad next door. Mrs. Haddad is 79 and doesn't hear the smoke alarm. They looked at each other. Denise pushed the rice and beans toward her. Renee ate. If you have ever been the person who gives without asking, you know how rarely the world notices. Renee did not think of herself as someone who was owed anything. She thought of herself as someone who did her job, raised her daughter, and kept her word. The 7 years she'd spent in that hospice were not a sacrifice to her in the grand sense. They were simply what she did, the same way she updated the spreadsheet on Sundays and angled Walter's blinds in the morning. It was the shape of her life. She did not expect anyone to see it. Walter died on a Tuesday morning at 5:52, when the parking lot light was just starting to catch the ceiling. Renee was not in his room at the moment he died. She was finishing a medication check 2 doors down. The nursing supervisor, Pauline, came to get her, and Renee set down her clipboard and walked down the corridor and stood in the doorway for a moment before she went in. He looked quiet. His hands were open the way they always were after she sang to him, and she found she was glad of that. She stayed with him for a few minutes after the documentation was done, as she did with every patient she lost, and she said goodbye in the private way she had developed over 7 years, which involved no ceremony and a great deal of presence. Then she went back to her shift and finished it and drove home. She did not go to his funeral because she expected anyone to notice her absence. She went because she could not imagine him having no one there. She looked up the service time through the public notice Cedarview was required to post for patients with no family, a small, practical document she'd had to reference before, and she noted the date, Wednesday at 10, and she checked her schedule and saw she had the day off. She told Cora she'd be back by noon. She put on her wool coat and drove her 12-year-old car with the slow leak in the front left tire to the cemetery on the east side of the city, and she stood at the edge of the grave and she sang 2 songs because that was what she had always done. She did not know a man in a good coat was watching her from 20 feet away. Douglas had arrived early. He had the notepad with Walter's description in his coat pocket alongside the sealed envelope, and he had expected to wait a long time or possibly not find her at all. He had not expected her to already be there, already singing, already doing the thing Walter had described to him on a gray afternoon in September, when Walter was well enough to be precise and precise enough to be believed. There is a woman on the overnight staff, Walter had said. I don't know her name, only her voice. She sings to me at night. I want to make sure she is found. Douglas had written this down. He had asked Walter for a description, and Walter had given one, careful and specific, the dark coat with the fraying left cuff, the measured way she set down whatever she was carrying before she sat, the particular song she sang when she thought he was already asleep. Walter had told him the song was something private, probably made for someone small and beloved, and that hearing it had done something to him he did not have words for in the time he had left to find them. Douglas had written it all down. He had come to the funeral because it was the one place he could think of where she might appear without requiring any search. He had been right. She was here. She was singing. After she finished the second song, she stood for a moment in the wind with her hands folded, and then she turned and saw him. He introduced himself with his full name and his firm, which she did not recognize, and he told her that he had been Walter Halloway's attorney for 17 years, and that he had been looking for her. She looked at him carefully in the way she looked at intake paperwork, taking in the details, and she said, "How did you know I'd be here?" "I didn't," he said. "I hoped." He asked if she could come to his office that Friday. She told him she worked Thursday nights and would need to sleep Friday morning, and could she come at 2 in the afternoon. He said yes without hesitation, and gave her a card with the address on it, and she put it in the pocket of the worn coat, and drove home, and stood in the kitchen for a long time before she started making lunch. She did not tell Cora. She did not know what to tell her. Denise called that evening because Denise always called after a patient death to check in, a habit she had kept faithfully for years. Renee told her about the man at the cemetery, the attorney, the appointment on Friday. There was a long pause on the phone. "Renee," Denise said, "do you know who Walter Halloway was?" "He was my patient." "Outside the hospice, I mean?" "No, I never looked him up." Another pause. "Maybe you should." Renee looked at her phone after they hung up. She thought about it for a while. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and went to check on Cora, who was doing algebra at the kitchen table with her earbuds in, and sat down across from her and watched her work for a few minutes until Cora looked up and took one earbud out. "You okay?" Cora asked. "Getting there," Renee said. She meant it as a small deflection. She found, sitting there looking at her daughter in the kitchen light, that it was also literally true. Friday afternoon came with a cold sky and a parking garage that charged $8 for the first hour, which Renee paid and noted mentally against the week's balance. Douglas's firm occupied a suite on the 14th floor of a building that smelled of heated air and carpet cleaner, and the receptionist offered her coffee and a seat on a gray upholstered bench, and she sat with her coat in her lap, and waited and looked at the framed prints on the wall and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity. Douglas came out himself to get her. He led her to a conference room with a long table and a window that looked out over the city's midpoint, and he set a folder in front of him and a sealed envelope to one side of it, and he poured her water from a glass pitcher and sat across from her and folded his hands. "Mrs. Moss," he said, "I want to tell you a few things about Walter Halloway before I tell you what's in that envelope, because I think the context matters." She nodded. She kept her hands flat on the table. He told her that Walter had built and sold a manufacturing company, that the proceeds had been quietly managed and partially endowed into a foundation bearing his name, that Walter had spent the last decade of his life in relatively private, deliberate work on hospice and end-of-life funding, and that he had been a man who believed with a precision that was almost uncomfortable in its specificity, that how a person dies reflects what a society truly thinks of its people. He told her that Walter had no surviving family by choice as much as by circumstance, that his wife had died 14 years ago and they had had no children, and that his estate, after the foundation's structured endowments, retained several personal bequests that Walter had updated as recently as 6 weeks before his death, Renee listened. She did not interrupt. He updated the will in September, Douglas said. He added a bequest by description rather than by name. Because he didn't know your name. He described you very specifically. He said you were a woman on the overnight staff who sang to him, and that you had a particular song you sang when you thought he was asleep, and that you had been doing this since his second night at the facility. He paused. He said it was the only human warmth he'd felt in years. Renee looked at the window. He left you $400,000, Douglas said, and a letter. The number reached her slowly, the way very large things do when you are not accustomed to them, arriving in pieces and then assembling into a shape that felt wrong simply because it was too large for the room she had been living in. She sat with it for a moment. She looked back at Douglas, and he was watching her with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has delivered difficult news often enough to know that silence is not the same as not understanding. He knew my name, she said. He found it out, Douglas said. About 3 weeks before he died, he asked his day nurse to check the schedule and tell him who worked the overnight rotation most consistently. He wrote it down. Douglas opened the folder and showed her a single index card in a shaky but deliberate hand. Renee Moss, it read, Overnight Aide, East Wing. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Douglas slid the sealed envelope across the table to her. Her name was on the front in the same handwriting, careful and slightly trembling. She picked it up. She turned it over once in her hands. She did not open it immediately, and he did not rush her. When she opened it, there were 2 folded pages inside, covered front and back in the same handwriting. And she read the first paragraph, and then she had to put it down for a moment. The letter said he was sorry it had taken him so long to learn her name. It said he had been a man who moved through most of his life believing that solitude was a kind of discipline, that needing people was a weakness he had successfully outgrown, and that she had, in 11 weeks of sitting in the dark and singing to him, undone the better part of that belief. It said that the song she sang when she thought he was asleep, the one without proper words, was the first thing in many years that had made him feel like someone was glad he was still in the world. It said he was glad to have been in it, partly because of her. It said he hoped the money would give her room to breathe, and that he had tried to make it enough to matter without making it so much that it changed her. It said he trusted that she would know what to do with it, because a woman who sings to strangers for no reason has her own kind of wisdom. He had signed it Walter, just that. Renee sat in the conference room on the 14th floor with the letter in her hands for longer than she had sat still in years. Douglas refilled her water and let her take the time she needed. Outside the window, the city moved through its afternoon in the ordinary way, buses and pedestrians and a patch of pale sky above the roofline, and none of it knew what had just happened in this room. She called Denise from the parking garage before she drove home. He left me $400,000, she said. Her voice came out flat, not because she wasn't feeling it, but because she was feeling it too much for her voice to carry it properly. Denise made a sound on the other end of the phone that wasn't a word, a long, exhaled breath that carried everything. Come over, Denise said. I'll feed you. I need to pick up Cora from school. Bring her. Come over. Renee sat in the parking garage with the engine idling, the $8 ticket on the passenger seat, Walter's letter folded in her coat pocket against her ribs. She had driven into this garage 2 hours ago with $312 in savings and a slow leak in the front left tire and a $45 activity fee she didn't know how she was going to cover. She would drive out of it, the same woman with the same coat and the same tire, And the same daughter who never asked for more than she could see was possible. And the world would look exactly identical from behind the wheel, and none of it would be the same. She let herself cry for about 4 minutes, alone in the car in the dim concrete dark. Not loudly and not for long, because crying loudly and long was a luxury she had never quite gotten around to acquiring. Then she wiped her face. Then she drove. She told Cora that night after dinner at Denise's kitchen table, where Denise had made chicken and rice and cornbread, and had sent her youngest grandson to his room with a plate so the adults could talk. Cora sat across from her mother and listened with the same steady eyes she'd always had. And when Renee finished explaining, Cora was quiet for a long moment. "He wrote you a letter," Cora said. "He did. Can I read it someday?" "Yes," Renee said. "Someday." Cora looked at the table, and then back at her mother. "So what happens now?" Denise, who had been leaning against the kitchen counter with her arms folded, and her expression doing several things at once, said, "What happens now is your mama has some room to breathe." Cora nodded slowly, turning this over. She was 15, and she had been doing math in her head her whole life, the same way her mother had. And Renee could see her doing it now, recalculating, adjusting variables, arriving somewhere new. "Okay," she said finally, and the word carried more weight than its one syllable suggested. What happened over the following months was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things usually are. Renee paid off the year's remaining rent in advance, which cost her about $7,000, and for the first time, and she couldn't remember how long, left her feeling like the floor was solid underfoot. She replaced the front left tire and the back right one, which had been quietly going thin for months, and which she had been choosing not to address because of the cost. She refilled Cora's inhaler prescription and bought 2 refills ahead, something she had never been able to do. She set aside a portion of the funds in a savings account that she did not touch. Let sit, watched accumulate interest in the small and faithful way that patient money does. She also